There are a few mysteries left on this planet, but the deep sea remains one of the last frontiers left to excite our imagination. In an era where most people are looking skywards, it seems strange that our own oceans still remain so unknown to us. The deep-sea Challenger may have been unable to find Cthulhu, but that doesn't make the denizens of the deep any less mysterious. While they might not be alien in strict definition, they certainly seem to come from another world. As for humans, as few as 40 feet below the surface is enough to put divers at risk for barotrauma. Barotrauma is any physical damage caused to bodily tissues due to a difference in pressure, but it's also a video game. Barotrauma is developed by Undertow Games and revolves around submarine combat, exploration, and just general silliness. The game takes place in the future where humans have established colonies on Jupiter's distant moon Europa. Because the moon's surface is constantly being bombarded by cosmic radiation, it proved necessary to build the first colonies under the surface and travel between them using subaquatic vehicles. Eventually, contact with Earth was lost entirely, and a new society emerged under the ice of Europa. Unfortunately, you're not alone in the European oceans, and you'll soon learn why all the submarines come standard with guns bigger than the crew members. The dramatic impact of submarines as a setting cannot be understated. The hatches seal shut, and you know you're trapped underwater. The hull's pops and groans as you descend into darkness serve as a reminder. The taste of machinery and recycled air is heavy in your lungs, while certain death looms just outside. Day and night ceases to have any meaning, and the sun becomes a distant memory. Personal space no longer exists, and escape is impossible, but there is some solace in that should death come, it will probably be swift. One submariner said, "They made us take all sorts of psychological tests. I'm pretty sure they wanted to make sure we weren't sane." Frankly, it's difficult to imagine an environment worse than the bowels of a submarine, and that's exactly why it's such an incredible setting. There's several movies about them, but they're strangely underutilized by video games. The breakout title, Iron Lung, is a prominent example, and while the gameplay is essentially a homework assignment whose final reward is a jump scare, it's incredible how far its setting carried it. To date, Barotrauma stands out to me as the closest game to reach the true potential of this concept. The main gameplay revolves around attempting to get from one side of the screen to the other, and managing to do it in one piece is usually up to the skill of you and the rest of your crew. While it's possible to play this game solo, I'm not sure I'd be able to recommend it. Wrangling NPC crewmates is annoying, and much of the game's good points only shine through when experienced with other players. It's a bit early in this video for a tangent, but PvE games appear to be on the rise in recent years, with certain notable examples being Valheim, Helldivers, Deep Rock Galactic, and Lethal Company. It's something I'm in full support of, even though the average number of friends for your typical nerd seems to be approaching 0. It's partially because I've always preferred cooperation over competition, but more pragmatically, I think it's a trend that's going to continue as PvP becomes increasingly vulnerable to more sophisticated cheating, scripts, and bots, while PvE will remain less tainted. Obviously, you can cheat in PvE as well, but it's not as fulfilling to the genetic dead ends of the world if they aren't actively making someone else's life worse to pretend they're somehow superior. The phrase fun with friends usually feels like a cop-out because everything is more fun with friends, but in all fairness, there's some experiences you'll only get with multiplayer. There's something uniquely satisfying about exploring a sunken wreck together and narrowly managing to drag your crewmate's dying body back to the sub so the doctor can inject them with 3 syringes of morphine. Truly cooperative games offer an experience unlike anything else, and all the way back to beating the original Contra on the NES with my brother, I'd say all of my most memorable gaming experiences have been with friends. Unfortunately, this kind of gameplay comes with a caveat of actually needing friends, and wrangling multiple people's schedules just to play is usually harder than the game itself. Playing with randos is a mixed bag, and so matchmaking is probably the greatest avenue for improvement for these games. Maybe in the future we'll finally be able to filter online lobbies by average IQ, but I digress. Anyway, assuming you've got friends, or at the very least acquaintances, you'll get to experience everything Barotrauma has to offer. There's multiple ways to play, and while some people enjoy role-playing in massive free-play servers, for this entire video I'll be talking mainly about the campaign. For the campaign, you'll start off with one of the basic subs all the way to the left of the overworld, and by basic, I mean bad. Your goal is to get all the way to the right of the overworld, and to do that, you go to the right of the underworld maps, but it's a little more complicated than that. Between each area is often an outpost, and there you can buy things like fuel rods for your reactor, ammo for your guns, or upgrade your submarine. The only way to afford these things is by doing missions for the outpost, and that throws a wrench into your plans because some people are going to ask you to do things that requires you to leave the safety of your sub. Well, relative safety at least. For some reason, almost all denizens of Europa have a seething hatred for giant floating metal tubes and will stop at nothing to tear it to shreds. Maybe it's because we're constantly screaming into the void with sonar. And while the outside of your sub might be armed to the teeth, getting things out from the inside proves to be a little bit more of a challenge. Anyway, there's several missions that you can do, like killing an enemy and all its children, cutting valuable minerals off the walls of an underwater cave, scavenging a wrecked submarine, or even exploring the ruins of an ancient alien civilization. Who knows what built these things, but once you turn off their home security system, you're free to take everything. Though playing with alien technology might not always be a good idea. They're worth good money if you can manage to haul them all the way to an outpost though. After that, it's their problem. All the fighting will drain your resources, and much of the money you earn will go right back into buying the raw ingredients for refilling ammo boxes and crafting explosives. Theoretically, you could harvest everything you need from the walls of caves and sustain your entire submarine with just what you can scavenge, but there's no point as you'll need money anyway, because without upgraded hulls, your submarine won't be able to handle the pressures of the later areas. The actual gameplay vacillates between what I'll call maintenance and violent explosive action. Things can go from 0 to 10 in a matter of seconds, but when you've got some time to yourself, you'll mostly be repairing junction boxes and other pieces of machinery. Also, I've got no idea why these things will suddenly burst into flames when the round starts, but at least it adds some excitement to life on the seafloor. If you're the captain, your job is mostly to avoid crashing into walls, yelling at your crew whenever some blips appear in the sonar, and then whining whenever the power goes out while you're trying to drive. Actually repairing things is just a matter of holding a screwdriver or wrench, clicking on it, and then waiting for a bar to fill. It's not exactly the most riveting gameplay, but it can become quite intense when you're desperately trying to restore power to the sub after the whole thing got flooded. It's also something for you to do in the slower moments, and when you're running larger teams, it gives the lowly assistants something to occupy their time. It's a curious effect where some gameplay element that appears to be utterly insipid on the surface can become quite compelling because it's being informed by all the other mechanics. You don't repair the junction boxes because you enjoy it, you do it because you'd rather they didn't catch on fire in the middle of an attack again. Also, it has surprising reach as it can affect decisions like, damn it, I hope that power surge didn't break all the junction boxes again. So something that seems like busy work can result in a surprisingly far-reaching strategical melange, even if it is partially punitive in nature. Where developers are constantly trying to think of new and exciting mechanics, something so simple seems like it shouldn't work, but it's similar to what makes those farming games work. At the very least, it's better than the alternative, which would be nothing to do. As long as it's towards some clearly defined goal, people are surprisingly tolerant towards simplistic, repetitive gameplay. I mean, look at MMOs like RuneScape. I've also touched on this in my Potion Games video, but strictly speaking, video games are just illusory pictures behind a monitor, and convincing our brains that they actually mean anything is one of our greatest skills. When it comes to bridging this gap, the player's time is the most prominent currency that games use to extract meaning from the real space into the game space. When you die in some platformer or shooter and need to start again at the beginning, what the game's really doing is penalizing your time, and the threat of that penalty is often what drives the player to improve. Not to downplay the very real emotional responses that video games can arouse, or that feelings of accomplishment can serve as motivation, but once again, until they start delivering electric shocks or draining your bank account on death, time will remain the standardized way to affect your corporeal form. Except maybe for horror games whose penalty is filling your bloodstream with stress hormones, but once again, I digress. Time also adds value, as does scarcity and effort, but it's simply to say that when you fire a nuclear railgun shell, you're gonna feel all the time and money you put into it whenever you click. And you better believe you'll feel it if you miss. Slowly growing attached to your ever-expanding horde of destruction is a prominent part of what makes these survivey, crafty, explory, shooty type games tick. The controls of the game are WASD, as well as 1 through 9 for your quick bar, which will almost always consist of a welding tool, screwdriver, wrench, underwater scooter, and plasma cutter, plus whatever weaponry the captain trusts you enough to carry around. Perhaps in larger crews you could specialize, but with my skeleton crew of me and my 2 slaves from that one space exploration run, everyone needs to do a little bit of everything. Apart from that, pretty much everything is done through the mouse. Many things like ammunition boxes, crates, and railgun shells can only be carried with your hands instead of your inventory, and honestly, I like it. Loading shells one by one has this strange appeal, and once again, the extra effort makes each one feel that much more special. That being said, the actual gameplay is difficult to pin down. In the most reductive sense, you're just running around a submarine waiting for things to shoot. But there is some depth to it all. The game is at its most interesting when you're forced to leave the relative safety of your sub and explore something in your diving suits. You'll be drifting around the remains of an old submarine and suddenly hear a gurgle in the distance. Flashlight in hand, gun in the other, the rest of the crew floats behind as you try every door, hoping that when you find the source of that sound, it'll at least be on your terms. Once you're reasonably certain you won't be attacked, you can start scavenging things to take back to your sub. To try and make some kind of analog, it's similar to something like Valheim, or more recently, Abiotic Factor, except your base travels with you and it's constantly under attack. The crafting is limited to things like equipment and ammunition, so there's very little you can do to customize your submarine during actual gameplay, but as a concept, it's great. Walking to and from your base in between expeditions is a significant time investment in those games, and having your bastion of safety mobile cuts that out almost entirely. That's not to say you won't find yourself some distance away from your submarine, but you're certainly going to feel it when you are. Bonus points for when you get left behind because the entire sub sank while you were outside picking some all-natural sea opium. The appeal to something like this has pedigree through games like Minecraft, but what's special about Barotrauma is its ambient pressure. Not the pressure outside the submarine, though that's certainly a part of it, but it's the pressure on the player. Even when there's nothing happening, something might happen, and that puts you into this heightened state of arousal which increases engagement. Horror games subsist almost entirely on this core concept, and when the entire environment itself is deadly, it adds some tension to the situation. This is all to say that the mechanics all work together to make a uniquely compelling experience. In case it wasn't obvious, I should probably mention that several things have been gamified. Most notably, an opening in the hull doesn't immediately destroy the entire submarine. With the Ocean Gate incident still in recent memory, I'm sure I don't need to remind you what would actually happen. Technically, we're on Europa, which has like 13% of Earth's gravity, so you would be able to go much deeper without experiencing the same pressures you'd find on Earth, but it's not like the game is expressing this reduced gravity through the physics. Of course, if the developers cared about that sort of thing, the game wouldn't actually be any fun, so who cares? Also, sending out an active sonar ping doesn't immediately liquefy the innards of anyone outside the sub. So up until now, I've been trying to remain positive, laying the groundwork for what makes its mechanics appealing, and trying to argue for its setting. But now it's time to address the Leviathan in the room, and that is its inescapable jank. You'll be flopping all over the place, your arms will do whatever they want, and the game will jostle you whenever it feels like it. The phrase physics demons was probably uttered amongst ourselves at least 50 times throughout our entire playthrough, and sometimes it feels like you're fighting the physics more than you are the enemies. Enemies sometimes inexplicably regenerate health, and when your supplies are limited, you really want to avoid mag dumping everything, but it's so difficult to plan your shots when you can't be certain that they won't just go nuh-uh 1 second later. I'd say it was because of lag, but I'm the host. Despite being surrounded by it, there is very little in the way of water physics. Your submarine will be permanently fixed into a horizontal position no matter how many times you're rammed by a Charybdis. If you drive headfirst into a wall, you'll just get jostled a bit, and any movement is purely the screen tilting to give the illusion of impact. Parts of the submarine are separated into rooms and fill bottom to top with water from 0 to 100%. The damage to your hulls only affects how quickly water flows in, and the illusion of water flowing from room to room is created using some sort of easing function between the relative water levels. If you watch the monitors, they're just rectangles that fill from bottom to top. Flowing water can push you, but that can sometimes result in you getting pushed downwards by invisible water until the room fills enough to swim because you're too far from the source to see it. The only dry places are your sub, outposts, and certain stations you'll come across. And thank heavens for that, because back when I first played, the alien ruins would have these massive dry rooms thanks to the water flowing algorithm not being able to handle more than a few rooms at once. And so you'd fall from the ceiling with no way to swim out. Kinda like what happened with this outpost. The only way to get out was to slowly plasma cut the walls and wait patiently for the game to spawn enough water to let you escape. And watching a massive room slowly fill perfectly horizontally despite having an open hole to the bottom of the ocean definitely broke the illusion a bit. Everything is done with procedural animations, which occasionally looks ridiculous, but at least it opens up some interesting avenues into twerk-based communication. Compared to something like Rain World, which is effectively the gold standard in procedural animation and environmental simulation, it's definitely lacking. To be fair, Rain World's art style is more blobular, which allows for some more grace periods between animations. Also took like 7 years to develop, but you don't see these kind of acrobatics in Rain World. That being said, procedural animation is really fitting, because when your game involves being swept away by torrents of water, it's best to treat the character and all their floppy limbs like just another physics object. People seem to mistake my clinical tone as contempt, so I'll reiterate that Barotrauma is something I've played willingly on multiple occasions for my own enjoyment, even before I made YouTube videos, which is the kind of approval that game developers can only strive for. But while Barotrauma is a fine experience, it is in my personal opinion that it achieves a mere fraction of what it as a concept is truly capable of. You might say it's still in development, just wait for them to improve it, but these are deep foundational issues. I'd like to use Barotrauma as a springboard to a much larger topic, and that is the concept of technical debt as well as other programming challenges. Anyone who's active in software development already knows what it means, but it's effectively the point of no return in programming. It's when all your very poor decisions start catching up with you, compounding upon themselves until you're left with a nightmarish tangle of spaghetti code, and rewriting the whole thing would be faster than continuing to work with your monolith of insanity. It's called technical debt because the more you rack up, the higher the interest payments become, until you've accrued so much that even if you worked all day, you'd never be able to pay back the interest. Of course, the inverse can be just as bad, if not worse. Spending days writing generic functions and elegant solutions to anticipatory problems that never actually manifest will waste just as much time, but unlike the other option, you haven't even finished the project yet. Every project is an eternal struggle between premature optimization and technical debt. And finding the balance between the two is the reason software architecture consultants can cost up to $1,000 an hour. It's a small price to pay if it can save hundreds of thousands in development time. Needing to deal with labyrinthine code bases is how you end up with Trainhead from Fallout. I'm willing to bet that some game comes to your mind when I mention Tangled Code, be it Project Zomboid, Cyberpunk 2077, or more recently, Kerbal Space Program 2. KSP2 is an excellent argument for why I never get excited about video games anymore. And there's a great video on the topic if you're curious, but when they revealed that laggy, bug-ridden mess, I was laden with a heavy heart as I watched those fans desperately tell themselves that they'll be able to fix it all in an update, knowing full well that an infection that deep is too expensive to simply patch out, and time eventually proved me right. There's more to the story, but simply put, they thought they were saving time reusing the old KSP1 code, only to inherit all of its technical debt without any of the expertise of the original crew. It quite literally would have been better to start from the ground up. Then there's everyone's favorite punching bag, Yandere Simulator, which brings even modern machines to their knees because half the game is inside the update loop and recalculates everything 60 times a second. The sequel to Marrow, yeah, I gotta bring that up at every opportunity, was all but cancelled due to the horrors of programming in the Construct engine. Stories like this are everywhere, but things that slip under the radar are all the games held together with spit and tape that never succumb to technical debt. Undertale's code is an absolute travesty, but it remains one of the most famous indie games of all time. Almost the entirety of VVVVVV, or V if you prefer, takes place in one massive function. Celeste has a sprawling 5,000-line class dedicated to updating the player's state in a way that looks like it grew like a fungus rather than following any set structure from the start. But none of that matters. The only time anyone would care about your code is if it's slow or buggy, and as long as it's neither, you can make it as awful as possible, at least until the debt collectors come knocking. You might have noticed some similarities between the games I've mentioned, and that's that they're all simplistic, two-dimensional indie games with limited physics and scope. When your technical requirements are low, whether through ignorance or impetuousness, it's much less likely that your programming will catch up with you before you finish your game. There's a saying amongst game developers: what do you call a game with messy code? Actually shipped. And just like my Factorio bases, sometimes a quick solution is better than an intelligent one. But when you're trying to beat something like C-Block, you can bet your bots that you're going to be paying dividends for every shirked design by the end. As for games killed by premature optimization, it's hard to give out any prominent examples, but that's probably because they never released at all. But I'm sure some game developer out there is watching this and nodding solemnly as he contemplates his project graveyard. For something like Barotrauma, adding actual water physics and tiltable submarines would be such a monumental endeavor that even professional studios would struggle with it, and so it's completely understandable why they chose the path they did. It certainly would have made the game better, but that's assuming that it's something that they could have reasonably achieved. One game developer said on the topic of game design, "You need to get used to killing your children," which hopefully won't get me flagged by YouTube, but it's simply to say sometimes you've got to let go of all those precious but complicated ideas you have. At this juncture, I should probably mention that despite being an engineer, I have no actual game development experience. But in the same way an IndyCar driver and a NASCAR driver both know that pushing the gas makes the car go forwards, I can make some inferences. Also, it's not that water physics would be particularly difficult to program, but unless your recommended hardware is a supercomputer, getting it to work at speed and across networks is the real Leviathan. There's a reason solving the Navier-Stokes equation would instantly win you a Nobel Prize, but anyway. There's been some discussion over why AAA developers elect to focus their efforts on graphics rather than some unique mechanic that could set their game apart like water physics, and allow me to offer my professional insight. It's because it's hard. Obviously graphics are difficult as well, but throwing more tries at something is often easier than rolling a state-of-the-art physics system, and they're also more transferable than something so hyper-specialized. That's not to say that modern developers don't have the capability of doing these things, they absolutely do, but I'll let you in on a secret. The people developing these things don't work at your local game studio, they work here, at Epic Games Incorporated in North Carolina. As the technical demands and expectations for video games increases, it also becomes increasingly difficult for companies to remain competitive. This is why companies like CD Projekt Red have started abandoning their in-house engines in favor of external engines like Unreal. And while there's undoubtedly some disadvantages to this approach, like losing 5% of your revenue from sales, evidently it's worth it for some companies to outsource their engine development. In fact, the vast majority do. At least you can blame them when it's a buggy mess. But Unity, Unreal, CryEngine, they're all trying to make a product, and to sell as much of that product as they can. That means they're primarily going to be focused on the general case, as well as making a smooth developer experience that works out of the box. Hyper-specialized physics, such as an underwater submarine simulator, aren't something that they would develop and standardize. There's simply no market for it. That significantly increases the overhead on working on one of these sort of cutting-edge projects. If you're dead set on developing your unique vision, you're gonna need to roll your own engine, or at the very least heavily modify one of the existing ones. Rainworld, once again, used Unity, but almost exclusively for its graphics rendering pipeline, while everything else from the animations to the physics had to be made in-house, which significantly increased development time. And you want to know what they got in return for 7 years of their lives and pushing the limits on ecosystem simulation? An abysmal score of 66 on Metacritic. Thankfully, despite its slow start, that's been corrected by now, but it stands to demonstrate that breaking boundaries isn't always met with immediate success. Also, it's important that I point out that I played it somewhere around here, so I'm allowed to retain my hipster cred. Other prominent examples of rolling your own engine would be The Witness, which also took 7 years, and Teardown, which are the only 2 games off the top of my head that made their own 3D physics engines. Oh yeah, there's also Overgrowth, which took a staggering 14 years to complete, and honestly, the thought of trying to set up my own 3D engine makes me break out in a cold sweat. But the point is, you're looking at substantially increased development times. However, sometimes it's worth it. Can you guess which game I'm thinking of? That's right, it's Factorio, everyone's favorite digital crack. Factorio is a marvel of modern game development. No other engine could hope to render millions of different items in constant motion without dropping a single frame. And that's because Factorio's engine is purpose-built with hundreds of little optimizations that exist solely for fitting as many iron plates on one map as possible. Trying to do that with Unity objects would cause your computer to spontaneously combust with 100 signs per minute, let alone 10,000. But once again, that comes at the cost of development time. And it's safe to say that none of these would have spent so much time and effort making their own engines if there was a pre-existing option that already met their specifications. Well, except maybe The Witness, but Jonathan Blow is weird. This isn't even to mention the amount of expertise required to build your own engine. Hopefully this won't be taken as me calling game programmers stupid, but on average, software developers are paid more than game developers, meaning that much of the available programming expertise is going to be taken up by higher paying positions elsewhere. When a programmer can get paid more somewhere else, sometimes passion is the only reason they'd put up with it. Additionally, the most qualified people are probably already working with, or could be working with, one of the existing engines, like Unreal, so pulling them into your project is gonna cost you. Being cost competitive with a billion-dollar organization is beyond most indies, so most can only leverage their own effort. Unless you've already got a minimum viable product to show off, that's a tough sell to publishers. What are you gonna tell them? Yeah, I've got this great idea for a video game. It's unlike anything you've ever seen before, which also means that it's a massive risk. But don't worry, it's only gonna take several highly skilled engineers 3 years to iron out the engine. After that, it'll be a breeze to finish the game in another 3 years. Understandably, they'll be a little dubious. Unless you're Star Citizen and people inexplicably throw millions of dollars at you so all your programmers can focus on burrito physics. Obviously, despite all these complications, these sort of super-specific passion projects are still being made, but this is all simply to say, it's difficult, and there's a reason they're not more common. Also, there's plenty of ways for indies to set themselves apart that don't require a master's in engineering and a minor in physics, like visual style or writing. To break away from this aside, my main hope is that this explains some of the complications in making something quote-unquote truly revolutionary, and why it's much easier to think about these things than actually design them. Basically, Barotrauma's greatest sin is making the exact game that I want to play, but leaving so much room for improvement that I can't help but think about everything that it could potentially accomplish, while also knowing how unlikely it is for that to ever happen. One of its inspirations was Space Station 13, as evidenced by the curious coalitions of clowns scattered throughout Europa. But the basics of putting a bunch of players together in one place and seeing what happens is a core tenet in both games. That being said, I've never really experienced Barotrauma outside of a few groups of friends, so I can't really speak to the general public server experience, especially with massive crews of 12. But Barotrauma is caught somewhere between a survival exploration game and a screw-around simulator. This is always a concern when making one of these videos, but inevitably someone will point their finger at me and accuse me of playing the game wrong because I've got the gall to criticize things they don't view as important. But clearly the developers wanted to be more than just screwing around. There is a story of sorts, and there is a final area with a conclusion, even if they are a little shallow. Hopefully I've explained well enough why I think that the core elements are fun, but as with anything, there's always room for improvement. The game struggles to scale meaningfully, and with the exception of one or two environmental hazards which rarely come into play, most biomes are effectively the same. The enemy composition is slightly changed, swapping out crawlers for threshers in most cases, as well as throwing some Molochs into the mix, but the general strategy remains the same: shoot at everything until it dies. That's fine, but again, because the areas fail to distinguish themselves, it doesn't feel much like progress, and many of the enemies you see at the end you'll still find near the beginning. Again, this is only an issue in the campaign, and that its focus is stuck between two general playstyles might explain the lapse in attention. The gameplay is essentially the same at the start as it is at the end. It does attempt to assuage this somewhat by forcing you to upgrade your submarine along the campaign, but the actual challenges you face are relatively static. This isn't something you notice playing only for a few hours in a multiplayer server, but beating the campaign probably takes at least 20 hours, and you're bound to feel the routine by then. The main things that liven up the trip are the missions, but you don't always have those in the direction you're going, especially if there's no outpost established there, and so many areas are simply traversing through vast expanses of nothingness. Which is fine, there's still things to shoot, but there's not much reason to get out and do things, even if you come across a wrecked submarine or a cave system. It's usually not worth your time to investigate those without a mission. Small caves can contain ores for you to harvest, but they're rarely the useful ones, and you can buy most of your supplies from an outpost anyway. Since there's no way to tell if there's anything worthwhile down there from inside the sub, it's better to just head to the next area. The wrecks can contain some useful things to salvage, like ammunition, but once you're out of the early game, once again, it's often not worth the effort or the danger. Having played this back in 2020, I've seen some things change, and one of them was the addition of rarities to certain items. Sure, you've already got a welding tool, but do you have a legendary welding tool? It welds faster, and they can spawn randomly in some places, which does incentivize investigating areas you'd otherwise would have ignored. It is a definite improvement over the previous option, where you'd just find useless duplicates of things you already have. There's also skills and talents that you can unlock after gaining enough experience, mostly through simply managing to not drown. Levels will unlock some useful buffs, or some complete game changers like the mech suit, and it does serve to assuage the lack of progress felt by creating some long-term goals. This makes me feel like the developers are at least aware of some of these shortcomings, but this sort of palliative game design doesn't really address the core issues. It's difficult to balance between making things worth investigating while also keeping the game engaging, because giving the player too much will remove all the challenge, but too little will make everyone ignore them. Also, you don't want it to become too predictable to the point that the player feels like they're obligated to scavenge rather than feel like they're exploring. They're worth visiting when they're for missions, so perhaps you could flip it. Instead of needing to have an assigned mission, you could simply add an area to outposts where you could turn in the identification plaque of sunken subs for a reward. Maybe it could occasionally be missing to make it less guaranteed and to imply that it had already been reported. Alternatively, make them commonly contain some sort of universally valuable item. Not like fuel rods, ammunition, or morphine, because all of those you can conceivably have in excess, but something like a permanent upgrade to certain machines. Upgrading is relegated entirely to clicking a box in an outpost in exchange for 8% more power output, so it would be nice to have some meta progression within the levels themselves. Something similar would also help the alien ruins, because while they are interesting, there's no real justification for visiting one without also having a mission there, because you'll almost certainly end up in the red after spending precious ammunition taking out all the guardians. The artifacts themselves are worth decent money, or can be deconstructed for various rare materials, but apart from that, they're pretty useless. I was using a mod this entire time, which revamped the system a bit, and made them actually potentially dangerous by requiring you to carry them around in this protective case unless you enjoyed vomiting on the floor. It also required you to identify them at a research station before you knew what they did, but it also added some beneficial artifacts, like ones that consume water, which is exactly what I'd wanted to see. The sounds and particle effects were annoying, but it made them feel special. If there was some carefully sprinkled lore throughout the ruins, it could help tie everything together into some narrative, but they're just kind of there. This is where it feels at odds with Space Station 13's gameplay, because there's many things I could suggest that would help pull it into some narrative, but that's only relevant for players like me who want to play through the whole campaign, which is apparently the minority. Some kind of expanding narrative would help the lack of tangible progress, but it wouldn't be relevant to the players who just want to join a server, play around a bit, and then never show up again, and so it's difficult to justify the development time. Also on the topic of progression are the submarines. You can't dynamically redesign submarines during playtime apart from being able to swap some guns or unwire all the junction boxes, but what you can do is buy different submarines. They cost money and are usually a market improvement in capability, but subs are rarely as simple as being an upgrade over the other. They come with their own confusing layouts, their own quirks and foibles, and when you buy a new one, you're forced to reorganize everything you had inside your old sub, which is potentially hundreds of items, so swapping is not a decision made lightly. Yet, you're forced to switch, because even if you're a fan of a particular sub, if it's not tier 3, you physically won't be able to upgrade the hulls enough to withstand the pressures of the final area. The problem was, I hated all the standard subs, and so some years ago I designed this sub that you've been watching this entire time. While you might not be able to edit them in-game, Barotrauma does allow you to design and build your own submarines, which is nice. I called this one the Naiad, and it's perfectly suited to smaller crews like mine. I'm pretty proud of it, but building your own submarine is an interesting experience. Because not only do you want it to be good, you also don't want it to be too good, because otherwise it won't be any fun. There's nothing stopping you from setting the thrust on the engine to 10,000 and the energy cost to 0 while also making it indestructible. Nothing apart from your honor, at least. Anyway, I thought it was fair enough to make it tier 2 and play with the crappy starter sub for a while, but eventually I needed to upgrade. Except, I liked my sub, so I was forced to make a carbon copy of it, but instead save it as tier 3 so I could access the final upgrades. Oh yeah, and it forced us to reorganize like 20 hours worth of garbage. This is probably less of an issue with larger crews, but my experience is the only one I've got, so that's what you'll get. I'm not asking for something like Cosma tier that would allow you to build the entire submarine in-game, but it would be nice to attach a hardpoint or two. Maybe make it so things like fabricators and shelf space are additional features you'll need to pay for, much like the heated seating in a Tesla. Overall, my greatest criticism of the game is pretty much everything outside of the sub. The world outside of the sub exists in two ways, the view from a weapon's periscope and the view from your character. One is substantially more zoomed out than the other, and though some things might look fine from the periscope, up close they just look like blown out JPEGs. Needing to swap between the two can make the perspectives seem inconsistent, which wouldn't be a problem if not for the fact that you're constantly leaving the sub, forcing you to experience this dissonance. While occasionally you are hit with a sense of awe when the true scale of a creature dawns on you, mostly you're just stuck floating in a void without anything to orient your scale against. Once you're outside, it feels like things were designed around the view from the guns rather than the player. There is a lack of fine detail and everything is made out of these jagged polygons. The repeating textures look pretty rough as well, and this is the inverse problem where it looks fine in person but horrible through the periscope. I'll have to give kudos to the developers, however, because their entire source code is public. You can just look it up. And out of curiosity, I snooped around their cave generation code. And when I looked at it, I was like, well, that explains everything. It's cellular noise. It seems what they're doing is randomly generating some graph of linked cells like this, and then randomly walking through cell by cell to create a path from start to finish. Any cells along a path gets turned into empty space, and everything else gets turned into rock. Simple. The jagged polygons make perfect sense now, but it's strange to me that they'd leave it at that. Not to be pedantic, but jagged points don't often exist in places where water is constantly flowing over them. It would be possible to run some higher frequency noise along the generated path and roughen it up a bit. If physics are the issue, it wouldn't even be necessary to give them collision. The smaller caves are equally jaggedy, and while there are some decorations and unique things to spice them up a bit, they still suffer from that feeling of scale. Again, it's not that it's bad to make the player feel like a speck floating in a massive cave network, but when everything is made out of lines 5 times as tall as the player, it's difficult to maintain any sort of reference. Rather than feeling dwarfed, it feels more like I zoomed in too much. Some narrower cave sections would be nice, but it doesn't seem like their Voronoi noise has enough granularity to allow that sort of thing to happen. It's cave diving. I want to be able to nutty-putty myself until a crewmate needs to pull me out. Kinda like this, except not because of a glitch. Similarly, the alien ruins end up looking like one of those termite mounds that someone poured a ton of molten aluminum into so that they could put it into a museum, because presumably they can't alter the algorithm to create empty spaces in cells that were already generated as stone. I don't want to sound presumptuous, maybe there was a reason they were forced to do it like this, but it does make the environments look a little jank. Also, there's no way of downplaying it, these repeating textures look like ass, and adding a procedural texture would go a long way to making it look natural. Overall, the cave generation is pretty boring, and maybe this is just because I played the captain the entire time, but from the first biome to the last, pretty much everything involves driving forwards in a straight line and making only minor adjustments in depth in order to avoid obstacles. Trying to find the way out is never a concern, and it probably can't get too fancy because anything too narrow would be impassable. It needs to be able to fit your sub, and because your sub is a fixed horizontal brick, there needs to be a lot of berth to ensure the map is actually completable, especially with some of the larger subs you can purchase. The game gives you the ability to attach little mini-subs to your main sub, and I would have loved to use them to explore really narrow but long passages far away from the main sub. But there's just no situations where it's necessary because of the way the cave generation works. In fact, it seems like the smaller caves intentionally prevent you from doing this. Despite being cavernous inside, the entrance is often just small enough to block any small craft from entering. There are some minor things to each biome, like floating chunks of ice, currents, or volcanoes, but because they don't really require any special attention, they feel less like obstacles and more like background elements. The closest you'll get with the cave forcing crew coordination is yelling at someone on the guns to blow up an ice spire because it's faster than going around, which is actually exactly the sort of thing I want to see, but it's also the only example. Again, I'm not sure if this is just me playing the game wrong, but the things I'd love to see in this setting are situations that encourage cooperation to overcome the harsh environment. You'll get some of that, like narrowly rescuing a fallen comrade, or crew members repairing the walls while the others blast away, and to me, that's the most compelling element, as well as the area with the most potential. Saving people just feels great, even though I think the medical system is a little silly in that morphine is essentially a health potion that solves everything to the point that we started calling ourselves the Mighty Morphine Power Rangers, but everyone scrambling around the sub while trying to take down an abyss monster is also its own unique experience, and anything that feeds into that dynamic is welcome in my book. Allow me to play the ideas guy for a moment, but should maximizing these situations be our goal, it seems appropriate to split them philosophically into the categories of expected and unexpected. Expected action would entail salvage missions, ruin exploration, and cave mining, things whose risks are well known and encourages preparation. The advantages of this category would be the tension that it builds, as well as the cognitive engagement on preparation. Conversely, unexpected action would entail sudden monster attacks. Of course, those could also be expected to some degree, but let's not split hairs, alright? Throwing some uncertainty into the mix is an excellent way to stop the game from feeling too routine, and it also keeps you and your crew on your toes, thus increasing tension. It's especially interesting if you throw it in while there's already action. Something like hiding creatures inside of lockers would be an option, as well as some enemies that don't constantly announce their presence by gurgling, but a more holistic approach would be incorporating something like machine malfunctions. Runaway engines, jamming coil guns, faulty connections, the oxygen generator suddenly pumping out carbon monoxide. Anything that could result in the captain frantically shouting at the engineers to turn off the engines manually before they crash into a wall. It seems like it would fit into the general loop of maintenance, and would be especially funny if it happens while you're already under attack. And now I'm imagining clearing the jammed coil guns by hammering fire like in Synthetic. It couldn't be any worse than the junction boxes already constantly catching on fire. When a bunch of small problems come together to create a big problem, now that's what I call emergent gameplay. And this sort of approach does have some pedigree with roguelikes, where reacting to and overcoming unexpected situations is basically the entire reason they remain interesting after hundreds of hours. The closest thing you'll have to these sorts of compounding issues would be an enemy causing you to sink into the abyss shortly before attracting the attention of the abyss creatures. There's also a few enemies that damage your electrical connections, which means you'll need to frantically repair them before you can get guns back online, so I don't want to imply that this game doesn't have things like that. It's more that these are the most memorable moments for me, and I wish that there were more opportunities for things like it to happen. There was that one time the ballast flora tried to drown me by sealing off the hatch, so that's something. As for the cooperation, there could be more situations that require a crewmate's help, like some sort of immobilizing monster a la Left 4 Dead, or maybe some monster that attaches itself to that one part of your back you can never reach. Something as simple as dragging players who can't use an underwater scooter themselves builds this feeling of camaraderie. So if you added something that was apparently banal, like requiring 2 players to carry a particularly large item, it would have a surprisingly deep impact, I feel. For people on the guns, you could make it so that more frequent reloads were necessary, or add some separate task that would allow it to run more effectively. Updating the user interface in order to convey a teammate's help would also go a long way to team building, and watching a new shell slide in as you're staring down a monster would just kind of be awesome. Obviously it would still be possible to do it all yourself, but teamwork would streamline things. Of course, simply saying, "just add more thing," is perhaps the blandest criticism possible, so I'm mostly advocating for certain philosophies and using these as an example. Again, allow me to reiterate that I actually enjoy this game, but while I'm still playing the ideas guy, I wish there were more environmental simulations. Pretty much all enemies want to kill you and are indefatigable in this purpose. Maybe it's because I've got Rain World on the brain, but it would be nice to have creatures that were neutral, mostly neutral and capable of being provoked, or outright hostile. Then have some run away as if they've actually got an ounce of a self-preservation instinct. Plus, actually have them interact with each other. Enemy behavior feels a little too straightforward, and if there were enemies that required special attention to avoid, that could be interesting. Perhaps if you entered the hunting grounds of a particularly nasty creature, others wouldn't follow you in, and if you settled down your engines to a quiet hum and told everyone to shut up for a moment, you might just get through unmolested. Obviously, full ecosystem simulation would require tons of effort to implement, and I'd actually be shocked if the devs hadn't considered it long before they ever started on this project, but it still needs to be said. There was a rather amusing situation where we had to kill a Moloch, but it sank us into the abyss only for it to get eaten by the Latcher and complete our mission for us. Also, as for the user interfaces, something inspired by the incredible UI designs of Hive Fleet would fit incredibly well for things like weapons or the navigation terminal. Oh, if you ask me, everything should aspire to Hive Fleet's UI design. I'm not going to complain that the sonar isn't really accurate to real life, but what I will complain about is the sound design. There is so much potential in the underwater soundscape, but there is very little in the way of environmental audio. When you're near the engines, you'd expect to hear them roaring, and when you're walking around, you'd expect to hear the subtle murmurs of the creaking hull and rushing water. Most egregiously, when you're approaching crush depth, you'd really expect to hear the hull start groaning and screaming in protest before finally bursting open. But there's no ambient clues that there's anything wrong, and unless you're the one driving it, it's only when random holes start opening up that you realize that you're in too deep. This kind of audio would go a long way to increasing immersion, and if everyone could hear that they were about to get crushed, maybe they'd be a little bit more attentive about plugging all the holes in the sub. Also, as far as I'm concerned, it's criminal that there isn't a klaxon alarm in this game. I mean, can you really call it a submarine if it doesn't go "Ooga"? I could speak forever about my ideas for this game, like the fact that there's little reason to exit the sub outside of missions, so needing to do something like cutting barnacles off the sub or cleaning off the guns would allow some opportunities for fun, re death. But overall, I'd just like to express my passion for this game and its setting, as well as explain why things like this rarely live up to their true potential. Barotrauma is a surprising success, and it gives me hope that one day they could take things to the next level. Personally, I couldn't imagine Barotrauma's current code bringing them to that level, but there's always room for Barotrauma 2. In some ways, still having room to grow is better than the alternative. My eagerness to don the cap of the ideas guy is a testament to how well their entire thing captured me, and it's fertile ground for all sorts of experiences. But I think I've talked enough. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all later.